The funny thing is, when I picked this movie, I picked it because it was just a random horror movie that I remember seeing a while ago that I liked. But then I didn't realize Dreyer did it. And I'm actually a big fan of Dreyer because he did another film, The Passion of Joan of Arc, which is one of my favorite silent films. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised when I realized he directed it. I didn't know that coming into it.
Yeah, I didn't either. When you mentioned Vampyr, I sort of had memories of a silent vampire movie, but I couldn't tell you who directed it or anything. I just remembered seeing it many years ago. But yes, I too saw The Passion of Joan of Arc and made a big impression. So interesting, this is the same guy, and this is the very next film he made, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, there was a lot of time in between both because both of these were huge financial flops.
Yeah, I know the critics weren't too fond of Vampire when it came out.
Mhm. Yeah. So Carl Theodor Dreyer he's kind of not prolific because during this time where you had no TV, films were released a lot more frequently. And you'd have directors during the time that he was making films that would have, sometimes 50 to 150 films released throughout the course of their career. And he's more in line with filmmakers today, where there are like several years sometimes in between each film he made. So for his time, he wasn't very prolific. But for now, like if you look at his total films he made throughout his career, it's a decent amount compared to today's standards. But he wasn't considered a very prolific filmmaker. Very artistic in the sense that he wasn't really concerned about commercial success. He was more so concerned about a certain vision that he had, uh, and that made his films a little bit more long-lasting than some of his contemporaries, but also not as financially successful.
Carl Dreyer, he seems like he was more comfortable as a silent filmmaker. He did a lot of his work, most of his work in the silent era. And this movie, Vampyr, was the first film that he made that was kind of a sound film, but it actually seems more like a silent film. And I think he was afraid of sound. He really wasn't too sure about it, so he kind of did it like it was a silent film. And much like Charlie Chaplin, who was kind of the same way, Chaplin resisted doing sound films for many years. In fact, doing Modern Times in 1936, which was really late for a silent film. This one was 4 years earlier, but still the same kind of thing where it does have sound on it. There is sound, there is sound effects, but it's basically a silent film as we kind of know it. Um, and I think part of the reason for that is the European market as well. They had to make their films available in several different languages. And so that was difficult. With a silent film, you could just replace the title cards and you basically could send the film out. So I think he felt if he reduced the amount of dialogue, kept it to a minimum, that it would be easier to market the film. And I think he was just more comfortable in that silent film style because he really didn't do that many after this. He really had a sparse career in sound.
Yeah, in my research for this, I couldn't nail down exactly why there was so little dialogue. Some of it was he was resistant to it, you'd read. Other places you'd read he shot most of it silent. Then it was late in production that they decided to move to sound. You're right, the language thing was one of it too, because it was supposed to be done in three different languages, even though it's impossible to find the English version at this point. And also, the other thing I read was during one of the screenings, they were laughing at the movie because the dialogue was so stilted. So because of that, it was Dreyer's decision to cut out a lot of the dialogue because it didn't come off right, and it could have came off badly because this was the very early days of sound, and they were still trying to figure it out, and you didn't have a lot of mobility. You just had to be very static when you were doing it, and also the fact that it was being done in three different languages, that could have contributed to the stilted dialogue. Did these actors actually know three languages? Were they doing it phonetically and they didn't even know what they were saying? A lot of that can lead to, bad scenes. So for whatever reason, it does come off as a silent film more so than a talkie. Another thing that I noticed too is the performances. There were some actors where they felt like modern performances. Like this feels like how someone would act in a modern film. But some of the actors, even in the same scenes, were acting like it was a silent film. They were doing the over exaggerations and the cartoonish, over the top acting as we know it now. But they were acting as if they knew they were in a silent film. So it was the contrast. I believe there was one scene where the doctor gets shot and killed, and the young woman and the older lady were hugging, and the older woman, she was crying and she was holding her and consoling her, but the young woman that she was holding was just like waving her arms in the air and flailing about. I'm like, are these two people in two separate movies here? So
Yeah, well, I guess one of the other things is that he used a lot of non-actors in this movie. Like a lot of these people, this was their first movie and it was their last movie. But there's a strange mix because some of them are actually accomplished actors. I think Sybil Schmitz, who plays one of the two daughters,
oh,
Leon.
Sybil, I know her.
Yeah. Well, she did appear in some movies. She did a few movies, and she actually died young, at age 45. It's a theme that I've mentioned before, but I find there's often someone who died young during a film, or someone in a film died young, and she did die young at age 45 of drug overdose, suicide, I believe. Um, but the other woman, Rena Mandel, who plays Giselle, her sister, this was her only film. So it's like one actress who has some experience and one actress who has no experience. So that could be part of what's going on. The only question is it the experienced silent actors who are doing the sort of less good performances, or is it the non-experienced actors who are doing the less good performances? I haven't tracked through to try and figure out, who exactly is, inexperienced and who is experienced, but it's an interesting question.
Mhm. Another interesting thing is that this isn't the first director we've spotlighted that has used a lot of real people instead of actors. We also have John Cassavetes when we did A Woman Under Influence, and last week when we did Vincent Gallo and Brown Bunny. Both of those, the interesting thing is not that all three filmmakers used real people instead of actors in some of their movies, if not several of their movies. It's also the fact that when you have John Cassavetes and Vincent Gallo, they were pretty much aiming for realism, whether intentionally
Yes.
or unintentionally. The pacing, the way the movies played out, the way the dialogue played out, the way the scenes played out, um, it was always a sense of this is real. This isn't Hollywood. This isn't glitz and glam. This is what real people do look like. A lot of scenes, it didn't even look like was any of the actors ever had makeup, and forget scenes in full movies. They just look like they just got up and started shooting. No hair, wardrobe, makeup, anything. um and the thing with Dreyer is he had the opposite approach, in that his philosophy was he wanted to get as far away from uh the constraints of reality. He was all about being surreal, being about expression, emotion, trying to go as far away from the camera as he possibly could. And what they were aiming for in the end result was very different. But in their approach, the tools they were using were very similar, in that they said, hey, I have this approach that's going right. I have this approach that's going left. But you know what? We're both going to use the same tools. We're both going to use real people to accomplish our goals. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is. And I was going to say the last thing I would describe this film as is realism. I don't see this as a very realistic movie, much more surreal. It's tempting to think of it in the context of the German Expressionist films because so many of those early silent horror films were German Expressionism. But this isn't that, though. This isn't really German Expressionism. It's something else. It's got its own kind of surrealistic style going on, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing too is another filmmaker I'll also mention, since I mentioned Cassavetes and Vincent Gallo, is Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who was a filmmaker who we also covered for All About Eve, and he was very much keep the camera fucking still. Don't move the goddamn camera. Give me my 2 shot, give me my 3 shot, just give me my basic shots. Let the actors and let the script and let the dialogue take control. All right. None of your fancy smanchy bullshit. Great filmmaker, did some great films, and you have this guy who's the exact opposite, who's like, you know what? Let's do as much as possible with the camera. Let's just throw everything at it. Let's just do everything possible to avoid basic shots, you know? And I find that incredibly interesting that you can have two filmmakers both make great films, both be you know, top 100 films. I think Passion of Joan of Arc is considered one of the greatest films ever made, as well as All About Eve. And we've covered them both, and I love them both. And you can have these two people who philosophically are like oil and water, you know, as far as like how they want to shoot a film. And it's not just that they're opposites, but the end result is also the opposite in that, you know, Mankiewicz, what did we say was the only flaw in All About Eve? Just the visual aspect, but the dialogue, the script, everything was just everything else was just top notch, perfect. And then the only flaw I found in Vampyr, we're going to talk about it later in our 3-hour review that you're going to take over, is the only flaw I found in the movie is like the story. It's like you didn't engage me in a story. But like visually, some of the things he was doing was just so amazing. I'm like taking notes. I'm stealing this, I'm stealing that. I'm doing all the things like when I do my next film, I'm like looking at all these things that I want to just incorporate in my own movies when I'm watching this thing. It's just a bombardment of like all these great things that you're seeing visually. But with the story, there's no substance to it. It's all style, but very little substance. So I just found that interesting as well.
Yeah, and that was exactly my feeling too, is that it's a beautiful movie to look at. There's a lot of really interesting shots, there's interesting moments. Story wise, yeah, this isn't really a movie to watch for story. It's not going to make a lot of sense to you. It's very cryptic. It's a very cryptic story, whatever story there is there. And I think if you watch it more than once, you'll start to understand it a little better, but it's not going to be satisfying in terms of telling you a story. Interestingly enough, it's based on the writing of Sheridan Le Fanu, and you know he's most famous for his lesbian vampire story Carmilla, which this is one of the things that's supposedly based on. Although they claim it's based on several stories that he wrote that were included in one collection, I believe. But I think primarily Carmilla is the one that it's based on. And that was very influential. It influenced Bram Stoker when he made Dracula. And there's been a whole lot of movies made based on Carmilla. There have been plays. I actually have a friend who's been writing a play adaptation of Carmilla for years. So yeah, it's really adapted a lot. And I think this might be the very first time that somebody tried to adapt it and make a film out of it. They did not include any of the lesbian aspect, though, which is interesting. They got rid of that. But you know, it's based on stories that actually are interesting and that people like to read, but it's not really, the end result of it is not really a story in the same way, I don't think, as if you were to read the original stories.
Another filmmaker I compare him to is Stanley Kubrick, in the sense that when Kubrick did his one horror movie in The Shining, he thought he was like, hey, I'm going to make a commercial movie. I'm going to make a movie that everyone's going to want to watch. he only forgot that he's Stanley Kubrick, and no, he's never going to get a wide audience because he's Stanley Kubrick. He's going to do some far out shit that's going to get him a cult following, but he's not he's not a filmmaker where like this is for the masses. I always he always thought of himself as commercial, because I think he even thought Eyes Wide Shut would be a commercial movie. That's why he got Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, but not a commercial director. The great director, my favorite director, but he always fooled himself in thinking he'd have commercial success. But he did The Shining because he wanted to do a commercial film. I'm gonna do this, this Stephen King movie. It's gonna have Jack Nicholson. It's gonna be huge, yeah. And it wasn't, but it's considered one of my favorite all-time horror movie. And I think the same thing happened with Dreyer. He had a financial bomb with The Passion of Joan of Arc, now looked at as one of the greatest films ever made, at least one of the greatest silence, films ever made. And he thought, hey, vampires are big, and they were big in the late 20s into the 30s, and everybody wanted to do a vampire movie. Dracula was huge, and vampires were the thing in pop culture, and he wanted to do his version as well. And they both had the same approach, but they both made films that today are looked at as like historically great, but neither were huge financial successes.
Yeah, that's true. Dracula, the book, had come out, and there was a play adaptation in 1927 that was hugely popular. I think that Dreyer started working on this movie before the movie Dracula came out, so I don't think he was influenced by it per se, but there are similarities. You can see some parallels there, and it could be that they were both very influenced by Sheridan Le Fanu, Carmilla. But yeah, it was definitely something in the air. Vampires were, I think he even made a comment that they're trendy or they're popular or something like that. And
Yeah.
he kind of said, yeah, I can do that. I can do that. But it turned out he couldn't quite do it in the same way that other people had done it. It didn't quite appeal to the audience in the way that, say, Dracula did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder why. You look at this movie, it's like, I love it, but I mean, come on, it's like, what's going on here? Like, why is the main character not involved in like defeating any of the villains? It's a very odd story,
yes,
as visually
it
dynamic as it is.
It is. And actually, Dracula, you could say, like, for a Todd Browning movie, it's one of his less visually interesting movies. And he was a silent director as well, who made Dracula sound film. And some people complain that it's kind of boring, that they don't see a lot of interesting shots in there. So in a way, he's telling the story, he's just telling the story. And that's what's working. Whereas this movie, he's not so much just telling the story, he's doing all kinds of things. It's again the polar opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the last thing I'll say about this film is it's interesting that what you hear about this film is that some people found it silly and they laughed at it, and some people found it scary. And it in the UK, it got the first film to receive an H for horrific. So it's kind of like a rating system, where younger kids can't see it. I don't know if it'd be equivalent of R, or at least maybe a PG-13. And there were scenes that needed to be edited down or edited out, like when they're putting the stake in into the corpse of the vampire to keep it on the earth. They had to cut that short because it was too horrific. And the end scene where the guy's being covered in the powder, they had to be cut that short because it was too horrific. But still, people were laughing at points where they were supposed to be scared. And I think that's a symptom of the genre in itself, in that one of my favorite genres or subgenre would be slasher films, which is right up there with noirs as far as like the subgenre I could just pop in and just watch. I could watch it in the middle of the movie, the end of it. I just love watching them. It could be any movie in that category. I would just watch it. But with slasher films, they're intended to be scary. But I laugh just as much as I find it scary. I probably laugh more than I'm scared watching it. And I think even serious horror movies like Paranormal Activity, your favorite film, I find that hilarious at times. I find it stupid, but I don't find it scary. And that's a hugely successful film. I mean, I know you bought the Blu-ray and a huge collection of it, but there are people that that find even successful or great horror movies to be silly, and I think it's a symptom of the genre. So I found that interesting.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely true. There is a fine line between humor and horror, and they do seem to go well together. Some of my favorite films are essentially funny horror films, spoofy
But
horror
in
films.
terms of unintentional, though, I guess is my point.
Yeah, well, that's true too. And I mean, we talked about The Haunting, which is one of the great haunted house films of all time, but it's also unintentionally funny at times, right? Unintentionally hilarious at times, but it's still scary and effective, and it still works as a serious ghost story, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of ups and downs with this film. It wasn't successful. Even at the time, I don't think he was even successful critically, much less commercially. It lost a lot of money. He didn't do another film for years called Dreyer. And today it's
That's
looked
true.
at as great. I don't know what that's doing for him. He's been dead for a long time now. Maybe it
That's
helps his
true.
legacy, but I don't know
Yeah.
what much it did for him. Uh, but and people didn't like it. They laughed
Hmm.
when they should have been scared. He edited it down because some of the scenes even he didn't think was worth keeping in the film. When he had his final cut, he could have kept those scenes in. He could have said, "Screw you guys, I'm going to keep these scenes in there. I think they're great." So even he
Hmm.
questioned some of what he did, but the end result is something that is greatly influential. And like I said, I'm looking at this, I'm taking notes because I'm like, holy crap, like I need to do some of this stuff. And I mean, there are two filmmakers in particular that I know I brought up a lot of filmmakers comparing him to, but there are a couple of filmmakers that just sing his praises. Guillermo del Toro, who did an audio commentary track for the film, and also David Lynch, who talked glowingly about him. And the first time I watched this film, I barely remember my first viewing of it, but I did know I watched it at least once. I didn't really see any connection there because I didn't think of it. But I did some research before I watched it here because I know we're doing it for the show. And then I read how big of a fan David Lynch was. As I'm watching this, I'm like, this is not scary. So it reminded me of, I don't know if you heard of the film Mother. It starred Jennifer Lawrence, and it was I forgot the
I
name of
think
the
so.
director.
I
Yeah.
think so.
Uh, can you just Google the name of the director for me so I don't have to like research later and put it on the screen? But Mother was a film that was advertised as a horror film, but it was really an art house film. So it made a lot of money because Jennifer Lawrence was in it, and it was a horror film. It was advertised as with the trailer. So the first weekend it made a lot of money, then it didn't make anything. And actually people hated it because they were promised one thing and they got another, which kind of reminds me of this in that this was probably pushed as a horror film. But if you were going into this thinking you're getting like a vampire movie and this is what you got, I could see why people would be pissed off. You go into this thinking you're going to get Dracula and you get this low budget art house film that has no real story. You can see why it would peeve people off. Um, so yeah, I definitely found that part of it interesting. What was the name of the director?
Darren Aronofsky.
Darren Aronofsky. Yeah, definitely a guy we should cover on this as
Yes.
well. But
Yes.
yeah, you set certain expectations and then you turn those expectations and you subvert them. That can be another reason why it's not popular amongst critics or fans because they were pitched one thing and they got another. Um, but I mean, maybe if it was more true in its advertising or its goals, then maybe it wouldn't have had such an icy reception. You go in expecting something that's going to be scary and thrills, and this is what you get instead, like artsy fartsy. It's gonna be like, wait a minute, this isn't what I signed up for here. So I can
Yeah,
definitely understand that aspect of it. Expectations has a lot to do with how people end up viewing something.
for sure. And I even find that for myself when I watch a movie. The first time I may hate it, And then I'll watch it again and I'll be expecting to hate it. I'll be expecting it to be terrible, but it will surprise me that it's a lot better than I thought. Or the opposite might happen where I'll love it and then my expectations are so high that when I watch it the second time, I'm like, why did I like this the first time? This doesn't seem as good. So, yeah, expectations definitely play a big part in it. And I know that Dreyer, he was a journalist, I guess, before he became a filmmaker. And he kind of went back to journalism for about 10 years after this film. I don't know if it's because of the failure of the film or the critical response, or, I'm not sure, but it's interesting that he disappeared for about 10 years from filmmaking before finally getting back to it.
Mhm. And to bring this back to David Lynch, I defy you to watch a David Lynch film, have a David Lynch, any David Lynch film, be the next film you see after you see this film, because the parallels are just unbelievable. Because when you watch a David Lynch film, it's the same emotions you get from watching this film. It's like visually stunning, confusing, bewilderment. It's like, what's going on? Wait, what? But you're fascinated, but it's just so odd. It's artistic, it's incredible, but it's just so odd. And the emotions I got from this, I'm like, this is so much like a David Lynch movie. So I can see like how he got direct inspiration from his style from doing a movie like this, where it's just like, all right, I'll come up with somewhat of a structure, but I'm more concerned about doing individually interesting stuff that evokes emotion and with a thin thread that's keeping this whole thing together. But from scene to scene, it's going to be, art, so.
Yeah, and I can totally see that, David Lynch. Yeah, now that you mention it, I've had similar feelings watching some of his films. What the hell is going on here? What is this character doing? I don't understand this moment. And it's all about the weird little moments as opposed to the through line. There isn't always a clear story. It's just like, oh, this is an interesting moment. This is an interesting visual thing. Let's just sit on this for a few minutes. So yeah, I can totally see how this film would be a huge influence to him.